Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Dan Matlichuk. I'm just a junior member of the program committee, so I got this assignment. So thank you for coming, for adhering to the pandemic protocols, which basically means no cookies. But we'll see. And as we begin, I want to thank our sponsors. So our platinum sponsor for the whole season is Kreitz Auto Group, and they are the exclusive local purveyors of Buick, GMC, BMW, Mercedes, and Sprinter. And Dale Kreitz Jr. and his colleagues have been our stalwart supporters that enable us to continue with our programs during this period and our scholarship program. In addition, we have sponsors, the United Community Bank, sponsors for our December program, and Tim back there, who's going to make this a YouTube available from the production, is an in-kind sponsor for us. So tonight, our subject is How America Lost Its Mind, Our Misinformation Crisis. You got to spend a lot of time in Cambridge, Massachusetts to come up with that. That's good. So the hypothesis from our speaker is that Americans are losing touch with reality. And on virtually every issue, from climate change to immigration, tens of millions of Americans have opinions and beliefs widely at odds with fact, rendering them unable to think sensibly about politics. So in his recent book, How America Lost Its Mind, tonight's speaker, Professor Thomas E. Patterson, explains the rise of a world of alternative facts and the cultural and political calamity that may be unfolding around us. Tonight, Dr. Patterson will make a case for engaging on the side of truth. Last guy to do that was Pontius Pilate, as I recall. That's a quote, that's right, he said, "What is truth?" And mutual respect in our present arms race between fact and fake, unity and division, civility and incivility. For the past 25 and a half years, Tom Patterson has served on the faculty of the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and is currently the Bradlee Professor of Government and the Press. Prior to that, Dr. Patterson served for almost 26 years as a professor of political science at the Maxwell School of Citizenship at Syracuse University. He holds a PhD from the University of Minnesota, his native state. And prior to embarking on his academic career, Dr. Patterson served in the Vietnam War as a lieutenant in the U.S. Army Special Forces. As is our custom, we'll listen and learn, and following Tom's presentation, we'll open the floor for your questions. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Tom Patterson.
Well, it's a excuse me. It's a delight to be here. I was here one time before. I think it's probably been about 20 years now, I think, and it was a different venue. I don't often find myself in a church, but I probably need it. So this is kind of a welcome change from the other place. And but when Professor De Cruz asked me if I would be interested, I had a wonderful time last time, and I think it took me about, I don't know, a nanosecond to say, when is it? So once I could check my calendar and it all worked, I said yes, and it's really a delight to be here. And This, by the way, is the first time that I've addressed a group without a mask on. I'm back in the classroom. We were away from March 2020 until early September of this year, but they require us to teach in a mask, and it's not quite the same, and I sort of feel almost liberated to be. And I don't think I'd have to go to Georgia to find my liberty, but it is nice to be here. So, well, I want to talk to you about what I think is a real crisis, and it's misinformation and how it's messing up our politics and our ability to kind of act collectively. I'm not going to give you many tough charts, but so this is probably the most complicated one to look at. This is actually kind of hard to put together, and so don't take this one to the bank in the sense of total accuracy, because over time, when you ask people about what they know about politics, you know, they're dealing with different people, different issues and the like, and so the comparisons aren't exact. But what I've done here is every 10 years, I went in and looked at public opinion polls where they had asked people factual questions about politics and made a rough estimate as to what the level of information happened to be on a decade by decade basis. Two things stand out in that chart, and I'll talk more about them as I proceed. If you'll notice, from 1950 to roughly 1980, in the upper line, there's a steady increase in the amount of information, how well people know politics. Americans are getting better informed. And then roughly in 1980, that line begins to come down. And the misinformed line, that's the red line, people, when you ask them a question about politics, get it wrong. That one begins to tick up. Now, that yellow line, these are the uninformed. These are the people who say, I don't know. They literally. What's different about the misinformed and the uninformed is that the misinformed think they know, but they're wrong. And that's a big difference between being uninformed and saying, I don't know. There's an openness that goes with being I don't know than to think you already have the answer. So you have an interest in world affairs, so I thought you might want to see a comparison. And the studies show that misinformation is on the rise in virtually every country. We live in different times. But what's interesting about this chart is where the United States sits in comparison with some other countries. This is a study that was done in 2017 based on nearly 30 factual questions about politics and public affairs. And the higher you are on that index, the less informed or the more misinformed you are. And you can see Americans are pretty high on that scale. Only Italians outrank Americans in that respect. I'm mostly Irish and German, so I can say those things with some impunity. So take a look at this. There's a chart here that somehow isn't showing, and the question was, you know, what do the assault on the Capitol and the COVID deaths have in common? And the fact is, misinformation is one of the things they have in common. Both of these developments were fueled by misinformation. The people who assaulted the Capitol on January 6th thought that Donald Trump had rightly won the election. And they went to the Capitol to try to set the record straight. And then with COVID, a lot of Americans have denied the facts around COVID. The survey that I used to illustrate that is early in the pandemic, before the vaccine is available, where we had to rely on social distancing and masks. And you have a lot of Americans saying that masks don't help you, that they don't protect you. Well, in fact, they do. You get about twice as much protection with a mask as without the mask. And if you add social distancing to it, according to the epidemiological studies, you get about 4 times the protection if you, as compared to not being masked and not respecting social distancing. But a lot of Americans did not think that was the case. And if you think about COVID-19, I don't know how we see this as anything but the largest public health failure in the nation's history. We should have been a world leader in terms of COVID. We have more hospital beds, more ICU units per capita than any country in the world. And yet, there we are, down near the bottom in terms of deaths per capita from COVID. And if we had the death rate of the EU, we're talking about 150,000 Americans would still be alive today. And if we had Canada's death rate, our neighbor to the north, we're talking about more than 500,000 Americans. And it's hard to put that number into perspective, but if you think about 5 atomic bombs about the size that dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you're talking about 5 American cities. That's what that 500,000 Americans represent. So how do we explain this? How do we explain this rise in misinformation and the damage that it's doing to us? I think there are 3 things I want to talk about. You could probably throw some more things into this mix, but given the time, I want to talk about human psychology, kind of how our minds work and why we're susceptible to misinformation. Talk about a change in our politics, the rise of party polarization. You're all familiar with that. And then the change in our media as we move from what I would call a low choice system to a high choice system that we have today. So you could have picked almost any issue. And Americans, Republicans and Democrats have been increasingly divided over the issues of our politics. This is one of them, and I picked it because it happens to be in the news at the moment because the Supreme Court is taking another look at where abortion is as a constitutional issue. But what's interesting about this chart, and it's true of most issues, Republicans and Democrats at one time weren't all that far apart. But on this abortion issue, for example, you can see they begin to move further and further apart, and now they're almost in quite different places on that particular issue. And here's another example of party polarization. Now, it won't surprise you that, and the Gallup poll has been asking Americans, do you approve or disapprove of the president's performance? The Gallup poll started in the mid-30s and very early on started to ask this question. There's never been a poll in the entire history of Gallup where Democrats had a more favorable view of a Republican president than did Republicans, or vice versa, right? So always you get some bonus from the people who are within your party. But what you can see in this particular chart is the distance between the Republicans who approve of a president and Democrats approving of a president has steadily widened. And this is right from the start of a presidency. So, when Biden took office, 90% of Republicans disapproved of what he was doing on day one. Now that's pretty hard to do, but the same thing. Democrats did the same thing with Donald Trump in 2017, and January day that he was inaugurated. We're really divided, and I think this is one example of that division. And then we think about people in the other party. In a democratic society, when you look at people who are on the other side of the aisle, you'd like to think that we see them as rivals or opponents, but increasingly we see them as enemies. And this is a recent poll that asked Republicans and Democrats, how do you look upon those in the other party? And as you can see, a little more than half of Republicans see Democrats as enemies, and a little over 40% of Democrats see Republicans as enemies. That's party polarization. Now, why does this matter? The reason it matters in terms of misinformation is that it heightens our tendency to use party as a cue in terms of the opinions that we form. You're a group that is very unusual, actually. You pay attention to news, you think about the issues, you weigh the evidence, You arrive at your opinions. That's not the way most citizens reach their opinions on issues of politics. They take shortcuts, what scholars call heuristics. They take cues. It may be a trusted friend, it may be a political leader, it may be someone like-minded in the media. And what's happened with party polarization is increasingly we're taking our cues from our party leaders. Democrats looking to Democratic leaders for their cues, Republicans to Republican leaders for their cues. And then for the like-minded media figures that are associated with one party or the other. Now here's an example of what I mean by cue taking. So there were two times, you'll recall, during the Syrian civil war where Syrian President Bashar al-Assad used chemical weapons against those who were trying to overthrow his government. 2013 and 2017. That's a violation of international law. And in 2013, the United States threatened to use missile strikes against Syria for that violation, and also did in 2017. These are what Republicans responded in poll questions about whether we should do that or not. So only 22% in the first instance. In the second instance, 87%. Are they thinking about the issue? What's going on here? Well, you have Barack Obama's the president in 2013. He's a Democrat. They're not going to take cues from a Democrat. And Donald Trump is the president in 2017. And if Donald Trump thinks we ought to do it, then we do it. Now, Democrats do it too. So this is the percentage of Democrats expressing approval of the bombing of Serbia in 1999 and the troop surge in Iraq in 2007. Both of these are increases in the use of military force as an instrument of international relations. Democrats like the one a lot better than the other. And again, what's the difference? Well, Bill Clinton's the president in 1999, and George W. Bush is the president in 2007. And if I put the Republicans up here for those two events, you flip in terms of their approval ratings. That's cue taking, and that's intensified with party polarization. So here's Donald Trump. Where are you going to get your cues from? If you're a Republican, you take them, not all Republicans do, but many do, from Donald Trump. So he claimed that the Dominion voting machines shifted hundreds of thousands of votes to Joe Biden. Well, Democrats, some thought that was the case, but a very large proportion of Republicans thought that was true. Now, in fact, there's no evidence to support that assertion. So it also matters for another reason. It's not only cue taking, and we're all guilty of this. We're all guilty of what's called, and I don't think we're guilty of it. Our brains are just wired that way, confirmation bias. This is a psychological tendency to look out at the world and see it the way you'd like to believe it to be, or you've learned to see it. Walter Lippmann, the great journalist, put it, we see the world that we prefer it to look. So here's some recent factual claims. I'll give you a minute or so just to take a quick look at them. Okay. Now, they're all false, right? But you can see that large percentages of Americans think that they're true. Nearly half in a couple of the instances, and a fourth in the case of whether Kamala Harris is a citizen or not. That's a lot of misinformation, right? But then you look at who's misinformed. And what you see, and the Democrats are in blue and the Republicans are in red, whenever there's a statement that's damaging about Republicans, Democrats are more likely to believe it. And it works the other way. When it's damaging to the Democrats, Republicans are far more likely to believe it. This is confirmation bias. When we hear a claim we don't necessarily judge it on its accuracy. We judge on whether it fits with what we'd like to think about our party or the other party. And if it's damaging and about the other party, we're likely to accept it as true. Now, a second explanation for the change is changes in our media system. Now, this is the media system that I grew up on, and looking around the room, many of you did as well. This is the old system, the low choice system. If you wanted to find out about national events on a day-to-day basis, it really had a limited number of choices. So at 6:30 in the evening, you could pick between ABC or CBS or NBC News, and then you had your local newspaper. And these were very substantial audiences. These were large news audiences. Now, the scholarship on this is pretty interesting about what the consequences of exposure to that news system were. For one thing it did was to create an information commons, meaning wherever you lived in the country, at least as far as national affairs was concerned, you were getting pretty much the same information, pretty much the same information baseline. You're hearing much the same thing about Democrats and about Republicans. We call that an information commons. Doesn't mean that we were interpreting it in the same way, that we assigned it the same meaning, but at least we were hearing the same factual information about the parties. That was one consequence of that type of media system. There's also good solid evidence that it was depolarizing, that it brought us closer together, because it was pretty evenly balanced in its coverage of Republicans and Democrats. You heard the good things and the bad things about both parties. And that actually served to kind of make Americans a little bit less confident in their own party, and also to give them a little more confidence in the other party than they might otherwise have. We came closer together as a nation around party politics. And then the third effect of that, and this is primarily due to the entry of network television into the news business. For a long time, that was the monopoly of the local newspaper. And then finally, when the networks got into the news business, there were some people who didn't read the newspaper who also became interested, in part because they were so fascinated with television, they'd watch anything. But by watching news enough, they actually became habitual news watchers, and they came to like it. And that had an impact on this rising level of information. And that takes me back to that first chart that I showed you, where Americans were becoming better informed because they had more exposure to national politics. But that system's gone, and a number of things have contributed to it. In 1987, the Fairness Doctrine was abolished, and what the Fairness Doctrine did was it required broadcasters to treat the opposing sides fairly, and that included public affairs programming. And what that actually did, it served to suppress partisan talk shows. When it was eliminated, suddenly the gate was open to partisan talk shows. The reason station owners didn't do it before the Fairness Doctrine was abolished was that if they carried a conservative talk show in prime time, they also had to carry a liberal talk show in prime time. And most station owners weren't interested in being a propaganda outlet for the other side. So they just didn't do it, right? But once the Fairness Doctrine was abolished, that's when partisan talk became part of our media system. And it accelerated pretty quickly. Now, most of this jump was due to the popularity of Rush Limbaugh and his talk show. But you can see just how quickly talk shows gathered an audience. There was a kind of almost an audience in waiting for this kind of communication. Now, the problem from the misinformation perspective is that these are not very reliable sources of information. This was a study that was done about 3 or 4 years ago, It's a Harvard study, a colleague of mine. But they looked at 4 million media messages, comparing them for the content. And they concluded that partisan media, including partisan talk shows, are distinctive for their disinformation, their lies, their half-truths, their mischaracterizations. I hate to tell you, but it's as true of Rachel Maddow as it is of Sean Hannity. Doesn't matter. It's the formula of the talk show, is that you distort the other side. That's what attracts an audience. Here's an example. This is from COVID-19, early on. Rush Limbaugh, no worse than the common cold, folks. And Sean Hannity, healthy people generally, 99% recover pretty fast, even if they contract it. Those were the messages that were going out on conservative talk shows early in the COVID pandemic. And if you listen to those programs, it had an impact. This is a survey that asked them, has this been blown out of proportion? Is this less dangerous than some people say it is? And if you were a regular listener to conservative talk radio, you said yes. It's been blown out of proportion. It's not as dangerous as has been said. Now, another piece of this high choice media system is cable. So cable comes into the American home in a substantial way in the 1980s. CNN, HBO, ESPN, these are all products of the early 80s. And you can see just how quickly cable television came to dominate our television offerings. This is very different than network television, right? With network television at 6:30 in the evening, if you wanted to watch television, you had to watch the news. And now you had choices. That's what I mean by a high choice system. And it wasn't long after that that partisan news comes to cable. 1996, it's Fox. Rupert Murdoch starts Fox News as a conservative alternative, and he hired Roger Ailes to run it. MSNBC started out as trying to compete with CNN, largely around news and not commentary, and it was struggling, and so it decided, well, maybe we can do better if we become the liberal alternative to Fox, and so in 2005, they made that shift in their programming. And then CNN, which was beginning to lose audience to both of these outlets, decided that it was going to, if not give up its mandate completely, at least get a little bit more into the business of talk shows and commentary. And it started to add liberal-leaning talk shows to its lineup. Now, it just lost, as you know, its most highly rated talk show host, but the Cuomos are having a lot of trouble nowadays. So it's not just Chris, but and these are different programs than the broadcast networks. You'll actually get more commentary. This is not Hannity and the like. This is the news programming on the cables. They're still filled with a lot of commentary and opinion and less factual reporting. And you can see that it's particularly true of MSNBC. It does much less reporting than the other two, but Fox does more commentary than it does reporting. CNN still does more reporting than commentary, but not by a large margin. And what we have seen with the audiences is people gravitate toward the outlets that tell them what they'd like to hear. So Republicans have gradually gone over to Fox, Democrats to MSNBC, CNN over time has become more and more an outlet for Democratic-leaning Americans. And you'll get different realities on these outlets. So this is a study that I did, and it compares Fox, not with CNN or MSNBC, but with CBS. What was the story of COVID? Well, if you listen to Fox or watch Fox News, You primarily heard about the impact in the early going of COVID on the economy, the damage it was doing to the economy. If you were paying attention to CBS News in the evening, they were talking mostly about the public health ramifications of COVID. Pretty much accurate reporting from both outlets, but for the most part, they were giving you different versions of reality, with Fox saying this is really about the economy, and CBS saying this is really about public health. And here's a really interesting study that was done by the New York Times, and they had developed a baseline as to how serious the threat was. And what they found was that Democrats overestimated the threat from COVID, how deadly it was, and Republicans tended to underestimate the threat. And this next chart is not going to surprise you. You've been hearing about it. Who's not vaccinated? This is an effective information. This is an information effect, or who you're listening to. So Republicans are about 4 times more likely than Democrats at this point in time not to be vaccinated. So we have a preference increasingly for partisan news. That's true also in social media. So these are the top 25 political blogs. And what really stands out here is there's not much appetite for moderate, middle-of-the-road blogging. You have trouble making a living if you're trying to work in that space. If you want to do well in the blogosphere, you better play to the right or you better play to the left. And they tend to be about equally successful in terms of social media. And when we come across misinformation and in the social media or regular information, what's the likelihood we're going to share it with our friends? Well, if it's supportive of our side, we share it. If it's damaging to our side, we tend not to share it. We tend to ignore it. That's us. We're compounding the problem of misinformation. So this is Twitter traffic. And I'm not going to try to explain exactly everything that this means, but these are tweets about mail-in voter fraud. So where would you expect most of the action to be? You'd expect it to be on the right, right? And you can see there's a lot more action among in tweeting information coming from right-wing media around mail-in fraud than on the left. And the other thing that stands out here is they really are 2 separate networks almost. In the area of tweeting, or whether it's blogs, or whether it's partisan talk, these audiences have very little overlap. The people who are moving and sharing the information are quite different. You've got kind of a Republican sphere, and you've got a Democratic sphere. And that highlighted the right as the focus of action, but it's us. It's not just the right. So there was a fake story. You'll remember at Standing Rock, where the Native Americans were protesting the Dakota Access Hotline, and there was a fake story that police went in and broke up the site, burned the teepees, that hundreds of thousands of tweets and posts occurred around that. That was a fake story. Almost all of that occurred on the left. The other interesting thing about fake, it gets our attention in a way that actual things don't. And this is kind of some thinking about why that is, usually because the stories are better, to be honest with you. Right? And so we're pretty much attracted to things like Pope Francis endorses Donald Trump for president. There's something pretty riveting about. But this is pretty systematic. The people who generate these fake stories are very good at it. They understand how to pull your lever and how do you get to share the information. And the studies that have been done, it travels about 6 times faster than actual news. So it moves pretty quickly through social media. And also contributing to the misinformation problem is there still are accurate sources out there of information, but we rely less and less on them. These are the audience figures now for the ones that I showed you earlier. The daily network news audience, I'm talking about ABC, NBC, CBS, that was 55 million. It's now 22 million. Newspaper circulation, it was 63 million in that earlier chart. It's now down to 26 million and shrinking almost by the week. Accurate information actually does counter misinformation. It's harder for misinformation to penetrate the minds of people who have accurate information. But if you don't have the information, then it's pretty easy entry for misinformation because it's not dislodging something that was there before. But the other problem is that our traditional media aren't as reliable as they once were. This is a conclusion from a Columbia University study that news organizations, and they're talking here about traditional news organizations, play a major role in propagating hoaxes, false claims, questionable rumors, and dubious viral content. And it's not so much that the reporters are twisting the facts, is that they're not vetting who they're quoting, who they're allowing to speak. And over 80% of the false claims that are in a news story, there's no signal to the audience that what's being said is inaccurate. There's no way of alerting the audience. That's a letdown on the part of our mainstream media. Here's an example. So let's take Donald Trump's tweets. He can't tweet anymore, so but he's setting up his own social media. So, but when he did tweet, a New York Times study found that about a third of those contained a significant falsehood. So, how did Americans learn about Trump's tweets? Well, about 1% were getting it directly from his Twitter feed, right? So there weren't actually that many Americans that were just wedded to his Twitter feed, right? 99% were coming directly or indirectly through the media, and much of this through the traditional media. These tweets were great stories, and they, in many of the news outlets, they actually had someone at the desk who was monitoring the Twitter feed so that they could get that up faster than the competitors. Well, they were pumping out a lot of misinformation in doing that. And I think we have a problem with our political leadership. There once were pretty strong norms against lying overtly and repeatedly on the part of our political leaders. That norm, I think, is greatly weakened. Another study, and I keep bringing these studies back up because we do have a lot of evidence about these particular issues, that where you find the highest levels of misinformation is when political leaders are driving it, when they're the ones that basically are not telling us the truth, are misinforming us for partisan political reasons. So how do we fix this problem? Well, we could hold our political leaders to account for lying. The problem is when our side does it, we tend not to detect it. You know, the only people who lie are those on the other side, right? And when we do detect it on our side, we've got a lot of other reasons for not going across the aisle. Right, so lying rate's pretty low in terms of whether we're going to base our vote on it or not. We could get our information from reliable sources, and there are still good sources out there. But increasingly, the demand is not for those traditional sources, but for the partisan sources. We like to be told that what we believe is the right thing to believe. We prefer that kind of confirming information to information that might create some dissonance or lead us to be a little unsettled about what we think. And we could hold ourselves to a higher standard. Now the problem is, I talked about confirmation bias. This has been with us since the beginning of time. And the difficulty of misinformation, we're wrong, but we think we're right. And the problem is we don't know when we're wrong. And then we have all sorts of mechanisms for telling us that we're right and fending off disconfirming information. So we could go to fact-checking, and you've all read fact checks. Now the studies are not very promising actually on fact-checking. People usually go to fact checks to find out that the other side is lying, not to see whether what they know is true or not. And then there's some evidence too that people forget whether information is true or false over time, right? So you carry the fact around, but what you gradually lose is whether it's accurate or not. And there's some evidence that fact-checking in the aggregate might actually compound the misinformation problem as opposed to being an answer to it. We could do media literacy, and many people talk about the importance of media literacy, and I think it is valuable. I do think it helps to get students to think about what they're reading and hearing, listening to, and judging it for its factual accuracy. The problem with media literacy, it's like the old civics education, which I was subjected to when I was in high school, right? You forget all that stuff in about a year. You know, when it comes to getting into the political arena and casting a vote, kind of the furthest thing in your mind is that civics course that you took 3 years earlier or 4 years earlier or whatever it is. And it's the same thing with media literacy. It's great when you're in the classroom and you're actually kind of studying a text and trying to make a judgment about it, but that's not the way we use the media. You know, we're bombarded with messages. We don't really have the time to study them, and they come in, they do their job. Some of them leave an impact. So I think the best alternative, at least in terms of the media alternatives, is platform intervention. The platforms have come under a lot of criticism recently. It's actually a huge job to police that space. It's easy to criticize Facebook, but when you're trying to police a space that has more than 1 billion users, that's not an easy job. They don't do enough. They don't do it well enough, and all of that. But I think that's the most promising. But there's a lot more research that needs to be done. And the algorithms that they're using to detect false information need to be improved substantially. Our center is doing a lot of work in this area, by the way. We've been working with the platforms to try to, and also get into the deep web, the dark web. One of the reasons why we're interested in doing that is not for the pornography and the other things that are there, although sometimes you wonder about researchers and what they're up to. But the real key with misinformation is to catch it, nip it in the bud. Because once it starts to go viral, it's almost impossible to rein back in. And then once it gets in people's heads, it's almost impossible to get it out of their heads. So the real goal of this is to catch it as early as possible and beat it down. It's like trying to fight forest fires. If you can catch it right away, you probably can do it. But once it gets out of hand, you don't have a chance. So, but here's my favorite fix. We got to break the hold of party polarization. This is crippling us, this divide between Republicans and Democrats. And if you look at American history, we're in a very unusual period, actually. We've had party polarization before, so that's not new. We've had close competition before, where the two parties are so closely matched. We've had that. What we have rarely had in American politics is when the two coincide. And that combination is a deadly combination. The parties are far apart, and yet they're so closely matched that either one can imagine winning the next election and controlling power. And that's an incentive to behave badly. That's an incentive to try to do everything you can to destroy the other party and to look for a momentary advantage politically. And if you look at history, we've actually had better government when one of the parties had a somewhat comfortable margin. Now that sounds kind of counterintuitive when we talk about competition and the importance of that in a democracy. Actually, we've usually had better government when one party was comfortable enough that it would be the majority party also in the next election or after the next election, that it could think about governing and not just think about electioneering. And I think that's what's it's going to take basically for us to get out of this cycle, is for either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party to begin to put some distance between itself and the other party, so that the next election isn't the only thing that our politicians are thinking about. So let me stop there. Thank you. Take your questions, observations, objections. I'm sure some of what I said probably didn't sit too well with some. So
Don't go away. No, you stay.
I'm staying down.
Now, our technical people tell me that if you have a question and we call on you, if you stand up and speak loudly enough, his microphone will pick it up for the YouTube rendition. So can we do that? Yes, ma'am, you're first.
I'm curious about your last point about one party being so much stronger than the other, that can help in the governing process. But what if the party that wants to become so much stronger wants to take away a lot of our liberties, wants to suppress voting, wants to end a woman's right to abortion? How do you square that? Suppose the Republicans become a lot more powerful. Do you think they'll just back off on all of that? Or do you think we're in for a substantial period of reduced democratic rights?
No, I think this is a really important question. And, I don't think we've seen such a kind of a frontal assault on ballot access that we've been seeing since the days of Jim Crow. That's disturbing. What to me is concerning is almost none of the Republicans in Congress want to stand up to that. Even though, at least it's said, that privately they don't like it, or many of them don't like it. But the cost of, in this closely competitive environment that we're in, and the way that our parties are configured, the big danger for most members of Congress is not the general election. The big danger is the primary election. If you get crosswise with your party, your career may end in the primary. So most of our incumbents who get through the primary process end up winning in the general election by overwhelming proportions. And that's what they're afraid of. They're really afraid of the primary voters. But I do think, let's assume that it is the Republican Party, that 15 years from now is clearly the dominant party. Certainly the ballot access question kind of goes away at that point. You don't need to try to reduce your opponent's vote margins by a percentage or two in the guise of trying to win an election if you're kind of winning comfortably, right? And it's kind of easier to take the moral high ground, when you're not looking at the possibility that you might be out of power, at the next election and the like. So I do think a lot of the bad behavior has to do with the close competitive nature of our parties at the moment. Now, you can create scenarios as to why it would be the Republican Party that would be the party that emerges as the dominant party. It's also to create a scenario for why the Democratic Party would be that party. And if we had about a half hour, I'd be happy to run through both of those. But yeah, please.
It may sound a little contradictory, but if you, I'm going to have a quote from Aristotle here. Republics decline into democracies, and democracies degenerate into despotisms. And I have friends who are to the left of Lenin and to the right of Attila the Hun. And depending upon which group I'm with, I adjust my thought processes, my conversations, and everything else. And interestingly, I read the New York Times, I read the Wall Street Journal, I watch Fox, I watch CNN. If I tell somebody I watch CNN or I watch Fox, depending upon the group, they'll walk away from me. And so I'm very pessimistic about where we're going as a country and where we're going to wind up, regardless of which party ultimately controls the government.
So the luxury of being a media scholar is I tell people I watch Fox and I watch CNN, but I'm a media scholar. That's why I do it, right? They somehow seem to understand that it's okay under those conditions. No, I think this is a very dangerous time. And I don't think I ever thought we'd be here. I mean, that's the other thing. And the problem on the voting rights question, so, voting rights are very different in law than rights of free speech, for example, or due process protections for the criminally accused. That law is pretty well established, and the wording of the Constitution at least helps a lot. The problem with what I would call democratic rights, including ballot access and the like, you have conflicting provisions of the Constitution. So you've got the original Constitution, which basically delegated to the states the authority to decide who would have ballot access, with a very small limitation. You couldn't impose restrictions that were greater than were imposed on the voters for your larger house of your state legislature. That's a pretty open-ended mandate to the states. Of course, then you get the 15th Amendment, race, the 19th Amendment, gender, and the like. There's plenty of things there for the Supreme Court, and what you basically do in that situation is you give the justices the opportunity to cherry pick which of those provisions they want to uphold. And what we were seeing in the period leading up to the Civil Rights Act of *64 was that the Supreme Court was increasingly looking upon the right to vote as a basic constitutional right. And finally got rid of the literacy tests, the poll tax, and the like. And an affirmation in a 1965 Supreme Court decision about voting being a basic right. Now this Supreme Court has moved away from that position on voting, right, and has increasingly deferred to states' judgments, and with some interesting decisions. I mean, with the voter ID law, for example, the majority acknowledged that it had a partisan motive, but said, well, it's only one of the things that they might have had in mind when they did the law, and so therefore it stands. Now that doesn't prioritize voting rights. That prioritizes something else. And the same thing with really weakening the Voting Rights Act by basically gutting it by removing Provision 5 and now weakening Provision 2. So it's a pretty limp instrument right now. There aren't many legal protections for voters that are out there.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, you touched on something in the answer to the first question that you didn't mention in the presentation, and that is that candidates are more afraid of the primary than they are of the general election. And I wonder to what extent you think redistricting and gerrymandering is part of the problem, and to the extent that it is there any solution to that?
Well, the Supreme Court says no, right? So there's another thing with the Supreme Court. So in 2019, it said judges are not allowed to intervene in partisan gerrymandering. Now, racial gerrymandering is still illegal. So they will intervene in that instance where it's pretty clear where a state legislature has drawn these boundaries to marginalize a historically disadvantaged group. But if they're doing it simply for partisan reasons, that decision basically says, even if you think it's wrong, you can't intervene. This is not. And that's kind of a long-standing kind of principle of, they applied it here. They hadn't been applying it here before, so that was new. But there was always this thing within the Supreme Court of what's a judicial question and what's a political question. And what the Supreme Court said, this is a political question, not a judicial one, because we don't have a formula that would allow judges to draw those boundaries, right? And therefore, this is not something that should be decided by courts of law. That was the position that they took. But they've really been very weak on democratic rights, kind of across the board.
Yes, sir.
About 15 years ago or so, I lived in Budapest, Hungary with my wife, and it was it emerged from the Soviet Union. It was a young democracy. Since I got back, I was shocked to see Viktor Orban taking over. He's muzzled the media over there. The legislature is basically kowtowed to Viktor Orban. And I didn't follow it that closely to see how that whole thing emerged. But now that he's in that situation with the media muzzled, I worry that something like that could happen here. And once we're in that situation with the media muzzled, how are we going to get out of this?
No, that pattern that we've seen in both Hungary, actually, and Turkey too, where Erdogan's done the same thing in Turkey, where part of the power grab has been having his friends buy the important media outlets and force out the ones that disagreed with him and put journalists in jail and the like. So, these were weak democracies in the first instance, and they clearly have degenerated. I think there's too much strength in this country for that to happen here. I think a lot of bad things can happen here, but the idea that somehow you're going to have a muted opposition, an enfeebled opposition, I don't think that can happen. And one thing the courts have been good about, they've been very strong on speech rights. Speech rights are fundamental to opposition. And if you look at most of those cases, or many of those cases are 9-0. So partisan differences haven't played a role when it comes to, and the Constitution, I think, is pretty clear in that area. And that kind of binds what justices can do. But I just think the traditions are too deep here. But I think the animosities are such that the other pathologies that we've seen are going to continue. This Congress is dysfunctional. We can't get anything done. And we've got big problems that just get worse by the year. And they get worse by the year because we can't act on them. You talk to Republicans and Democrats in Congress, they both agree that comprehensive immigration reform is necessary. They won't touch it because it's a political third rail. I mean, it's just going to lead to the defeat of some of them, so they won't touch the darn thing. So I think those kinds of things are going to continue. And kind of the nastiness that we see in some of the states, I think that's going to continue. But I don't think we have the culture or the history or the depth of institutions that would allow us to go quite as far as either Hungary or Turkey have gone.
Yes, sir.
One thing I didn't hear from you, can you explain how money has paid some contributions to misinformation? The money facts.
It's always the money, right? Right. Yeah. No, and you're right. I mean, look. Well, if you think about partisan talk shows, for example, if you look at the history of them, it's really interesting. There's a wonderful book. It's by a couple of scholars at Tufts, and it's really about, it's called The Outrage Industry. And it really talks about how they kind of tried to figure out what the model was, what worked, right? And some of them actually did the kind of the back and forth, let's talk about these issues kind. And what they were finding is they couldn't get any traction with audience. And of course, in the commercial media space, if you can't get audience traction, that's a money thing, right? And what does work is outrage, mischaracterizations, and the like. And again, what that study showed is that, you know, outrage is as characteristic of, you know, liberal talk radio as it is of conservative talk radio. Now, what's interesting about the difference between the two is liberals seem not to have much interest in it, right? So over 90% of the partisan talk audience is conservative. And liberals have tried hard. Mario Cuomo tried it. The former senator of Minnesota, Al Franken, tried it. Didn't work. Kind of the one person who made it work a little bit and turned it into a career was Rachel Maddow. But there aren't very many success stories on the left. I think liberals think that NPR is their radio. So right.
So, on that just point you just made, how do you rate public radio and television as a data source? So objective.
Actually, I think their reporting in a narrow sense is quite objective. I mean, I don't think they twist the facts. You know, but if I were looking at it from a conservative perspective, I think their agenda is not a balanced agenda. So you think about the kind of issues that get a lot of attention on NPR. You know, the Christian community doesn't get very much attention on NPR. And I would bet probably less attention than the gay community. Right, so I think in terms of the agenda, kind of the stories that they do, I think there is a selection process that tilts to the left. But the studies that have been done in terms of when they do a story, do they slant it, do they twist it? The studies seem to show that, no, they play it pretty well straight down the middle and really do fact-checking internally. They have pretty exhaustive fact-checking tests that they use so that they kind of don't inadvertently pump out misinformation. But you know, I do think in terms of their agenda, I don't want to call it an agenda in the political agenda sense, but just when they're kind of mapping out what they think is an interesting story, they're probably more likely to find something on the left that they would think, oh, there's a story there that we ought to be doing, than something on the right.
And now we need to finish. You all have missed Tucker Carlson tonight. And I don't think we're going to get Huntley Brinkley or Walter Cronkite back to fix us yet. But we do want to thank you, Dr. Patterson, very much.
So I was actually hoping that we could talk till about midnight. I grew up in Minnesota, and the football game tonight is Pittsburgh versus Minnesota, and if you're a Minnesota Vikings fan, almost every football game in every season, you want to avoid it if you can. So, but it's been a delight to be here. Thank you so much.
And you'll know that next month, January 20th, Ambassador Larry Silverman, who's recently moved to our area, will be speaking to us. So we look forward to seeing you.